Imagine, a podcast series by Imagine Theatre.
Hello again, I hope you're well. My name's Martin Ballard, and would you believe we are more than halfway through the calendar year? Welcome to episode 32 of this podcast series from one of the UK's biggest producers of pantomime and children's theatre.
For more information, go to their website at www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.
Now, of course, I hope you've been listening to all of our previous episodes, but a quick reminder that if you've missed any of my conversations with creatives, actors or behind-the-scenes tours of Imagine Theatre, you can catch up with them at any time. They are all still available. And don't forget to subscribe to the series so that you don't miss out on any future episodes. Now, in episode 31, we spoke to the keyboard player, musical director, arranger and veteran of 30 years of panto, Steve Power. This time, I'm delighted to be joined by one of the UK's leading experts on British pantomime. He is Senior Curator of Modern and Contemporary Theatre and Performance at the Victoria and Albert Museum, Simon Sladen. How are you, Simon?
Hello, Martin. Well, I'm very well, thank you, and it's lovely to be invited back.
Well, it's a delight to catch up with you as well, because a lot of things have changed since we spoke a year ago. I wonder, first of all, if you can tell us what you make of Panto's return since COVID-19.
Yeah, it's funny to think it was a year ago and we were looking at all those things that happened. I mean, we're at this period now where we're seeing most of the announcements are there. Big change in the landscape, actually, and thinking about particularly how Imagine have got a number of new venues coming on, looking at the more diverse casting which is coming out, which is absolutely fantastic. Seems to be at this present state in time fewer Aladdins than we might expect, maybe reflecting a trend to reappraise, re-look at how we might represent that narrative. So I think we're really in a state of evolution, and I would argue that absolutely COVID has been sort of a caesura where we're now in a new chapter. What should casting be like, and what can it be? How might we tell some of those more problematic stories? How might we introduce more inclusive narratives? And how might we also get pantomime to a wider audience, not only in the theatre, but at home? You know, still a number of venues investing in streaming their shows. A number of those are already on sale for Christmas. And venues like the New Wolsey in Ipswich, integrating that also into the live performance. So whether you're at home or in the theatre, you get a really great experience. And it's so interesting at these points where you can't do something like we had with COVID. It does force us to reflect, which certainly with the panto industry being an all year round activity, you know, day in, day out, it's really welcome actually for us to be able to go, let's regroup, let's reassess, let's refresh, revive, and let's see what the next 100, 200 century of pantomime might look like.
I think you're absolutely right. Evolution is a key word, and that's probably one of the main reasons why pantomime has lasted so long. It's continued to evolve, not just in our lifetimes, but also across the centuries. But before we look ahead to where it might go in the future, it's really important to acknowledge where it came from in the past, because there is no doubt, from its very outset, pantomime has always evolved, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key to that is, unlike almost all other forms, pantomime, it has a willingness to evolve. And actually, that is what has kept it alive. You know, we can trace those roots back to the 16th century in Italy. Troops of strolling players, entertaining audiences from town to town, the Commedia dell'arte. Those performances, stock roles, stock narrative, most frequently revolved around two lovers separated by a meddling older figure. So that sounds very familiar to what we have today, of course. And that popularity of that form, the people's performances, you know, outside, not really very much around language, but about visual, about spectacle, about dancing. It spread all across mainland Europe, and we've got early records in the UK of them, a troupe performing for Queen Elizabeth I in 1602. And actually English writers loved these characters of Harlequin and Columbine, or the Italian Alecchino, Combina, Pantalone, you know, that they were integrating them into their plays in about 1607 onwards. And so it's very interesting to see that, you know, we're embracing that, bringing those characters, but it's not until 1717 that dance master John Weaver revives the term pantomime, and revives it really from the classical Greek and Roman pantomimus, meaning a form of entertainment with meaning conveyed through gesture and movement. Now, this new work had a title that we wouldn't recognise today, The Loves of Mars and Venus, and it was inspired by classical legends. Now, like its historical predecessor in the Greek and Roman times, the story was told through dance, gesture and music. Sound familiar? Which made him actually, and pantomime, a very interesting birth in that chapter, because not only do many of us argue that that was the birth of pantomime, but it was also the birth of ballet. And it's very interesting to think about those hierarchies of culture, those hierarchies of theatre, where some might argue today ballet is seen as incredibly high art and incredibly at the top of that apex, whereas some might argue pantomime is not. So it's interesting, they come from the same sort of kernel there. And of course there's so much evolution that's going on throughout the time, and it taking its influences from medieval mystery plays where we see cross-dressed characters like Mrs. Noah, who's always drunk and a bit nagging, or Mac the sheep stealer's wife. We see it in the tradition of mumming and the hobby horse or animal guising. Today we have pantomime geese and cows and not as many horses as we did. But there are a couple of people that I think we really need to acknowledge in this trajectory, if you like. So one of them is John Rich, famous director, theatre manager, and played Harlequin, and he actually created in many ways the Harlequinade, which was a set piece which had slapstick business featuring those characters from the Commedia dell'arte. And it's very interesting because prior to pantomime as we know it today, the pantomime was in two parts. You'd have the beginning, which was this classical folk tale or maybe a fairy tale, and then the characters and the actors would transform and do this slapstick sequence at the end. Now, over time, that section at the end sort of fell out of favour. Some might argue that the passing of Joseph Grimaldi, the great clown who really put clowning at the centre when he appeared, particularly the 1806 production of Mother Goose, he died in 1837, and many people at that point went, will anybody be as good? And it's funny to think about these points, as we said before, about ballet and pantomime coming at the same time, because as Grimaldi dies, we see the popularisation of the principal boy, the female principal boy, with Madame Vestris playing that. And of course that's a tradition very much embraced by Victorian society. The dame, the female principal boy, celebrating that cross-dressing that goes on. Now, of course, probably only about 8 to 10% of productions have a female principal boy. But certainly the Victorian period that we get to is where the crystallisation of the form, thanks to Augustus Harris at Drury Lane. In 1883 they dropped the Harlequinade completely, and Harris really brings spectacle, story, scenography and stars to the stage. He wasn't the first to cast these big musical stars, but certainly popularised it and was one of them. So Dan Leno, the famous Dane and comic, or Mary Lloyd, much anticipated with their new business that went onto the stage. And many people would argue that Dan Leno, who was at Drury Lane for 15 seasons, is the archetype of the modern pantomime dame. And of course there's a form that's really evolved depending on dominant modes of cross-dress performance. So Danny LaRue giving a huge new interpretation of the dame and popularising that. Now we see those roots a little bit before with people like Douglas Byng, and of course today there's a whole different way of approaching the dame, whether that's the more glamorous, more down to earth, some might argue in a more believable tradition as well. And I think that's the thing, there is such a diverse array of practices that the celebration of conventions and history with this willingness to evolve means that's another reason why we want to go back. We want to see what's changed, what's new, what's exciting, and whether that's a new form or whether that's bringing in, putting your glasses on and seeing 3D or seeing A New Time of Flying, hearing the new songs from the year. It's like a living newspaper of the year that we get to see with our families.
Now, of course, throughout this evolution, lots of things have actually changed. The original myths and legends have slowly been replaced by fairy tales. We've seen all sorts of areas of the entertainment business and beyond welcomed with open arms by pantomime producers. New technology has had its say in where panto has gone. New traditions, new conventions have been picked up along the way. But I wonder what it is about pantomime now in the 21st century that is important, do you think? What are the key elements as we move forward? For me, I'm talking about things like making children in the audience at the very heart of everything pantomime stands for, and also, again, bringing people in from all areas of the entertainment business under one sort of heading for Panto season?
I think there are a couple of things that we need to always remember in terms of what makes the genre unique. And actually it's very interesting thinking about it having the sister arts of maybe musical theatre or musical comedy as well. So what makes it unique? Well, one is audience participation. That is incredibly unique and actually helps build this shared community of Pantoland, that we all feel part of it, we all feel invested in it. Now, the stock characters are going through a huge transformation, and we might talk about that in a bit, but at the centre of it is a transformation of an individual, but also a discussion of the polarities of good and bad. Historically, that might have been a good fairy and a bad fairy. Today, it might be an individual character thinking about their actions, but certainly those things are key to them. And I think, as you said, Martin, this celebration of the diverse theatrical landscape of practice, from circus, to maybe even athletics in terms of seeing roller skates or specialty acts. Certainly the use of music, of comedy, of slapstick, of verbal dexterity in texts. I think those things are absolutely key in moving forward. And I think there will always be a central character which has to go on a quest, which has to go on a journey with some other characters. And I think one of the other key conventions, in addition to absolutely that audience participation, is some evidence of what we might term as cross-dressing. That might be a dame, it might be a male-identifying performer playing a female-identifying role. That might also be a female principal boy. It might also, we might decide that we need to expand that definition to include our wonderful drag performers who are playing villains and fairies, or we might also say that also is embraced by individuals playing the cow or the goose as walking, talking characters now. And I think that's part of it. And I think the final thing really is that awareness of the presence, of the now, of this is for this day, on this month, in this year. As soon as it loses that, it loses some of that speciality of this is for us, this is now, we're here in that moment. And very, very few other art forms have that power and that potential.
Now, it's really interesting that you touched upon the character list and casting, because I think even if we maintain the same Panto title list in the future, we may not see exactly the same characters. And diversity of casting and various other things have to be key elements of Panto moving forward.
I think what we're seeing, and this goes back to our slight discussion about the impact of the pandemic, that really, especially when we went into lockdown and we didn't know whether we were going to be able to have a Panto season, and it's been really rough and challenging for the last few seasons, and that's not going to go away either. How can you, putting it bluntly, boil pantomime down to the smallest possible cast and still deliver the audience's expectations? And I think it's interesting that all of those shows still retained a dame. Of course, we have Snow Whites that don't have a dame, but it's seen as a marker of pantomime. They have a magical character, whether that's a villain or a fairy or some aspect of magic in it. And of course, we've seen the conflation of characters, so funny principal boys, for example. So it might be an Aladdin that also takes on some of those roles of wishy-washy, perhaps. But we have seen in some companies and practices an eradication of the father figure, so the baron or the emperor or the mayor or the squire. You've seen an eradication of those. I don't think that you could ever do Cinderella without the sisters. For example, I've seen productions where there's just one sister, but of course they qualify as the villain there. But it is interesting to think you could probably boil it down to maybe 4 characters or more multi-rolling within that. And I think that goes back to what are some of those nuts and bolts. An individual, whether that's Jack, Cinderella, Aladdin, Dick, they go on an adventure, on a quest, and there's some level of transformation. Now, how that's achieved depends on that character component around it. Normally one of those will be a comic character. You might get a dame and a comic, you might get one or the other. You might even get a funny, comedic fairy, for example. So I think there are different ways of delivering that. And I think that's what's always very difficult. You often have the first pantomime you saw in your head as being traditional. And I always try not to use the word traditional because there's a whole different landscape of practices and conventions that help us define pantomime. Tradition is just when they become repeated. And that's not necessarily a good thing, because it can lead to forms becoming quite stale.
It's an interesting point that you make about the pressure on producers post-COVID, maybe having to streamline the character lists and the cast to save money or to be as cost effective as possible after some very challenging financial times. But there may be other reasons why conventions get changed in terms of casting and so on. I mean, the Palladium has this reputation and the expectation is there for a lavish, large cast. And yet the Dame this Christmas will not be played by a man, it'll be played by Dawn French. And again, that doesn't really matter, does it?
I don't think so at all, because I think one of the things that pantomime does very well is it tells everybody this is the character, and we believe in that character, and some of the layers from the comedic interplay come from who's playing that character. So whether that is Pamela Anderson playing the Genie of the Lamp coming down on a surfboard, that's funny because we all know Pamela Anderson is. We know that she was in Baywatch. We see her doing that, and that's funny. Dawn French is one of our best comedians who, embraces a lot of pantomime traditions, has done it before as the villain. So we want to see that character there. And of course, she joins a long line of female comedians who have played Dame, from Nellie Wallace, Dora Bryan, Molly Sugden. All of these people have played Dame, and they have a very particular archetype around them. And I think it's the character that we love, and we see those levels of who is playing them, and we acknowledge those and we embrace that. And I think it'd be great to see more female dames. It would be great to see more female comics. It would be great to see much more mixing it up. And I think one of the things that the 1980s did for the genre, when we were going through a period of what I would argue was extreme standardisation, we'd already seen that in really starting in the 1920s, but in the 1950s and then the 1980s, we see extreme standardisation. We see fewer companies. We see more recycling of scripts and materials because there's less competition. We see an increase in certainly the use of celebrities from television who don't know the form as well, or maybe are going on stage for the first time, which means there's less time to invest in everything else. And of course, that use of the same stock year after year with not so many changes is great for business. You move them around venues, but doesn't do much for innovation. And we're now at a point where innovation is absolutely being celebrated. Also, the 1980s were a very challenging time for theatre. Commercialism, Thatcher, government there, sponsorship was all out. We saw Cadbury's, we saw McDonald's, we saw lots of things coming into it. So I think we're now in a good moment where we do have a set of producers that are really thinking about what the genre is, who's it serving, where can we go, and are willing to take risks, to innovate. Imagine last year doing the drag panto, that was wonderful to see that occurring, and that was another development which we hope we'll see much more of. So I think we are in a good time, and each year we're seeing pockets of change. And of course that's the thing. Once somebody does it, it just takes that first person to step over the threshold and everyone to go, why haven't we done this all the time?
I think you're absolutely right, and not only did Imagine lead the way with that first drag panto last year, but a couple of years ago, you may remember, also had the first digital design sets on LED screens in a venue that simply couldn't support traditional cloths and portals and so on. And it's those innovations that help to keep panto evolving.
Yeah, and there's great things to think about. What are some of those challenging facing us as a society, but also as an industry? So we need more diverse casting to reflect those audiences and those communities, which we're very slowly seeing. And it's great to see the posters coming out this year with many, many more, diverse castings there, members of the global community being represented. Fantastic. We've got more work to do there. Also, the sustainability agenda. These shows already, as we know, the sets are used and they tour around. That's good. We're not making a new each year. But there is something very interesting from a sustainability point of view about that mode that was developed by Nina and Mark for that first outing at Croydon, and the extra layers of interaction. Pantomime has always said audience participation and interaction is key. How can we increase that? So I'm sure many of the listeners will remember when technology came out, so you could bring a camera on stage and you could then live stream it onto a huge projection onto the stage, and you could pick somebody out and you could, put graphics on there and talk to them in that way. Another way of breaking the fourth wall or encouraging interaction. And I think that's what's really exciting. It doesn't ever, the best pantomimes, acknowledge its past and say those were the better times. It goes, what is the technology? What can we use now? I mean, really, a lot of our technology in the theatre, from flying technology to scenic change technology, comes from producers, designers really wanting to push the envelope. And if you think about some of the flying technology today, also probably most frequently used in pantomime, that is used in other productions in the film industry. And there are a lot of scholars who very much agree that pantomime was key foundation for the founding of the film and the cinematic industry, because of the way that it used technology and because of those stories and the dissemination of them, which of course we have a fleet of stories now. And what I was going to mention earlier, which I forgot in my trail of musings, was that 1980s period of Disney. And the other standardization pillar that I often think about is, we see some of those stories really, really get standardized in terms of the titles because of the proliferation of Disney. People are getting their fairy tales via that. We're seeing them issued on VHS for the first time, so that definitely has an impact in that. And the ability to then to watch that at home, to get to know and love those stories, influences some of those names of the characters, influences some of those narratives in certain ways. But I do think we're in a very exciting time this season. Already, as you mentioned, the Palladium, we've got a female Dame, amazing. And as we know, what happens at the Palladium, people look at, just like at Drury Lane, they think that's great, that's very popular, that's the dominant, or that's the largest production, and then that trickles down. It does trickle down.
I think you're absolutely right. That Disney Renaissance period in the 1980s under Michael Eisner, with the likes of Howard Ashman and Alan Menken, and tales like Beauty and the Beast and The Little Mermaid and others, had a massive impact on panto. And I wonder whether you think that might happen again with an influence from Disney or elsewhere that might bring in brand new titles for the future.
We certainly in the last few years have seen an increase in Beauty and the Beast after the live action remake. Absolutely. That is a title that was not in the top 5 previously and is now way up there, and people are investing in new scripts in those productions. I think in addition to that, absolute observation of those Disney musicals, the Menken and Ashman, the 1980s they started re-releasing some things from the vault, so 1980s we see Sleeping Beauty re-released, but I do think the live action stuff that's coming out now is definitely solidifying maybe some of those things, but also complicating, because if one of those shows docks somewhere and you're trying to put the same title on, that is a challenge. I mean, when Aladdin the musical was running, it's no surprise that there were fewer productions of Aladdin in and around the capital because of the marketing prowess and that of that show. What excited me about lockdown and the pantomimes that were being dreamt up then were, they were new titles. They were often, whatever it might be, Dame Dolly Saves the Day or Saves Pantoland, or we saw other ones that were a bit more episodic to enable cast to isolate or be in certain scenes. The Alice in Wonderlands, the Treasure Islands coming back. I mean, if we go back to the Victorian era, titles were very rarely done again and had all manner of names. It's interesting to see after the Palladiums of Goldilocks, we're seeing more scatterings of that. I would love to see people pushing forward with new titles and new renderings and going, okay, why don't we set pantomime in space? We could have an alien that's a villain. We could have them all aboard a spaceship or a rocket or something like that. I wonder where we're going to get our new stories from, because there is a lot of discussion around the Brothers Grimm or those 19th and 20th century narratives not reflecting society today. So is it that we'll just evolve our own versions of those stories, whether that's Cinderella or whether that's reimagining Jack and the Beanstalk? Or might we start to invent new ones or have ones that are inspired by other things? I mean, there's always a call out from the community of when will we see a revival of Little Bo Peep? When will we see Humpty Dumpty? And I think people are calling out for that because those narratives are not well known, they're not set in stone, there is no well-known and appreciated Disneyfication of them, and they could really enable some playfulness, which I think people really want. There is absolutely an argument for familiarity, but there's familiarity in the form, and I think Beric Kaler always used to say, when he was at York Theatre Royal, I could do the phone book, the pantomime, and people would become, because they'd know what to expect, they'd know those conventions were ticked off. And in essence, the nub of a lot of those narratives are the same. If we boil it back down to what we were speaking about earlier, an individual goes on a journey and transforms, their life is transformed in some way. And I think certainly in the times we're living in now, we all sort of daydream or see ourselves in that. It would be great to have a transformation, to be able to imagine other things, and to know that at the end, with the help of friends, with the help of community, there is a happy ending. People do live happily ever after. But there is a shift there from working hard and doing it yourself rather than a benevolent intervention, which of course was a lot of narratives revolve around. And that's something that I've seen a lot more recently, less magic intervention. There may still be an immortal character, a benevolent agent, a fairy, but often not using their magic as much, being more encouraging or watching over and supporting, which is interesting because there is no easy fix. And again, it's just a way that pantomime responds to the time, captures the sentiment, those tastes, those trends, where society is at that moment. And it is a great way to look at history. It is a great way to excavate society at any time. And it is our national art form for those reasons. We should absolutely be celebrating that because it's unique. It's absolutely a unique art form. In my opinion, should be certainly on the same level as ballet.
I think it's really important that Panto remains both topical and relevant, isn't it? And we talked about reflecting the society on any given performance day, whether that be in the character list diversity of casting, topicality of things that are happening in the news used in the script, local references and so on. But also, it has to reflect ever-changing society's views on any given subject. There may be a number of things that were okay and acceptable 100 years ago in Panto storylines that are no longer acceptable, maybe just uncomfortable in the 21st century. For me, the defenseless female lead being protected and saved, if you like, by a prince, a knight in shining armour, I think is not necessarily relevant of the view in the 21st century. And of course there are other storylines, whether it be Aladdin, whether it be Dick Whittington or others, that have to be tweaked because of changing views.
Yeah, and I think that's where we're in a good situation because we are much more having those discussions. And I think there is a real energy and a commitment to have them and to learn from the past and to change. And I would hope that everybody would get on board with that. And actually it can be difficult because for many people they'll see that as eradicating certain aspects of tradition or using tradition as an excuse for presenting things in those ways. But it is really down to all of us within the industry to take an honest look at what is happening and to say, let's absolutely drive forward with an inclusive, exciting art form which does so much for the importance of the theatrical landscape, to keep it relevant, to keep it surviving, to keep it evolving, and to play our part in history.
Now, I just wanted to finish by asking you about your role as senior curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum, not just in terms of modern and contemporary theatre and performance, but in particular in pantomime. I wonder if the V&A is fully recovered now and fully open again post-COVID-19. And for those people who've never been before, if they come along now, what can they see in your various collections?
Well, you know, the pandemic has affected all cultural institutions. You know, we absolutely are coming back stronger than ever. We're now open 7 days a week and the V&A is completely free for everybody to come in. Whilst we were closed to the public, me and my team were working very hard in our galleries to put a number of new objects and items and archival materials on display. And for the Panto fans of you out there, you can see historic Panto playbills, you can see pantomime costumes. We've got Principal Boyd costume from the 1920s on display. We've got Beric Kaler's costume for Pantomime Dame on display. We've got one of Clive Rose Dame shoes on display. We've got some lovely pantomime designs. We've also got a pantomime set model for 1900s for Humpty Dumpty and the City of Coral on display. So there's a lot of things that hopefully people would enjoy seeing, in addition to costumes, sets, props. We've got some interactive stations where you can explore the landscape of drama and dance and musical theatre. So everybody from Ian McKellen to Elphaba in Wicked, from Mazido Pan-African Dance Ensemble to Ram Gopal's amazing dancers and the Garuda there. We've also got Joey from Warhorse on display, so you can see him up close, that magnificent puppet. Quite a pantomime horse, but equally as stunning, not as comedic, of course. But yeah, the galleries are open 7 days a week, and every day at 2:30 we do a free tour. So if anybody wants to come down for a free tour, then do come at 2:30 and be taken around the galleries. And we also have another room in the museum, in the British galleries, which is called Laughing Matters, the State of a Nation, which is a gallery I curated looking at the history of the last 120, 150 years through the lens of comedy. So where does pantomime sit within that? So we've got a pantomime Dame costume from Hackney Empire Sleeping Beauty when it was the EU referendum, so known as the Brexit dress, which the Dame came on to much laughter and recognition of that moment. Half of it's the Union Jack, half of it's the EU flag. We've got some early song sheets from versions of Aladdin to look at how those roles were absolutely racist depictions of people in China, and how language was a key component of creating that archetype, and also the way makeup was used there. And we've got some of those other shared progenitors. So Punch and Judy shares its roots with the Commedia dell'arte very much, and so we've got some of those puppets on display. And you can even see Sooty, who was in many a pantomime as well, of course, still going strong, and doesn't look a day older than he broke into the profession.
So I think we'd agree, Simon, that Panto has come out of COVID-19 reinvigorated with a new positive creative outlook. So does that make you optimistic for the future of pantomime?
Absolutely, and I think that is what is so exciting. We are seeing new voices into the industry. Venues are commissioning new writers. People are wanting to write, to direct, to choreograph, to be in pantomime. And I think that's what will keep it alive. That openness, the willingness to evolve, the willingness to change, the willingness to embrace the new. It should never be a closed shop where a certain group of people deliver what they believe it is, and then that delivery is done decade in after decade. You know, it's all about the now, it's all about the new, and in many ways it's all about the audience. And I think as long as we retain that tripartite, it will keep evolving, and hopefully, you know, in 100, 200 years, people will be listening to this marvellous podcast and going, oh yeah, they got it right. We are keeping those values, we are changing and evolving, but we can still trace our roots all the way back to 16th century Italy.
Simon, as always, it's been a pleasure catching up. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thanks so much.
Well, I'm afraid that's it for another episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the series to catch up with any episodes you've missed so far, and make sure you don't miss out in the future. Make sure you join me next time when we'll be celebrating the return of children to pantomimes this Christmas, when I'll be going behind the scenes to find out what really happens at Imagine's Junior Ensemble auditions. Just imagine. I'll see you then.
Thank you for listening to the latest edition of Just Imagine, the podcast series from Imagine Theatre. And you can find out more by going to www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.